Okay, it says 10 o'clock, not 10:30. I'll have to talk to communications about that.
Okay.
And it is, that we're live now. Yep.
Okay. Okay. We are going, welcome everyone to the Water Policy Committee today. Councilmember Sundberg may chime in a little later, but he's out right now. So myself and Councilmember Gardner are here to facilitate the meeting. Councilmember Gardner, are you okay with the minutes to approve?
Yeah, I don't have any changes.
Okay, and I don't either, so we'll approve those minutes and get those to Councilmember Sundberg for signature. Consent items 2A, Steve.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So we did have one change order this month, and this was at the Griswold Water Purification Facility. It's a surge tank project that we're working on out there. And the change order was for about $29,000, and it's comprised of two elements. What we're finding through the whole, disruption with shipping and all that and just getting materials made, we found that one of the materials that was specified in the project was going to take 8 months to manufacture and deliver. We found an alternative material that only took 6 weeks to manufacture and deliver. So we made the change after we found that information out, just so we could keep the project on schedule. So that was part of the cost that we incurred there. The other part was more of a safety item. One of the pipelines that was constructed for this project was a relatively small diameter, 20 inches. This particular run of pipe had to be welded both inside and outside in order to meet the thrust restraints and everything that we needed for the project. Unfortunately, the contractor could not find a welder that was willing to go inside a 20-inch diameter pipe, so the pipe had to be upsized. Basically, the welders were claiming, it was in violation of OSHA and all that to have something that small to work in to actually weld. So the additional cost on the change order was for upsizing the diameter of that particular run of pipe so that we could safely get somebody to go in, weld it, and then also get one of our people in to inspect it. So that's really the components of that change order. So is there any questions?
Councilmember Gardner, do you have any questions?
Nope, I wouldn't want to climb inside a 20-inch pipe either.
Either.
I hear you.
No questions from me.
I saw
as well.
John sitting there measuring what 20 inches was.
All right,
No
thank you.
questions from me either. Thank you so much, Steve. 2B, John Murphy on the water supply update.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Well, it's been the year it's been, I guess. A couple things I wanted to point out. At the top of the report, I usually report on the weather data for around the city, and on the total precipitation, this weather station we use for this is basically the DIA weather station, and it typically, well, it's way out there, and so we've had some rain, and so I threw in the local rain gauges in there to add some perspective. In Aurora, we did get a bit more rain in various locations than we saw at DIA, and that was probably the case also yesterday and the day before too. We had between 2 and 3 inches of rain yesterday and the day before here in Aurora as well. So that's good news. That'll keep consumption down a little bit for a few days. The other thing I was going to mention is I changed up on page 7. I used to have this paragraph in there describing the different dates that we peaked in storage. And it was getting a bit cumbersome, so I changed that to a table to make it a little bit more readable. And as you can see, this year we peaked in July 9th at only 73% of storage. And so not going to get any better than that for this year. That was sort of the peak of our storage. And as you can see from the table, it varies from year to year, but the last couple of years it's been down a little bit. We are doing our best to get all the water we can into storage. For example, we have a current opportunity now to exchange some water from our reusable return flows at the Metro wastewater plant up into Strontia Springs Reservoir. Primarily because of the rain and stuff that we've been having, it's allowed the flows in the river to create the opportunity for us to run that exchange. And so we'll do that opportunistically as we have the chance to do. And other than that, if there are any questions.
Councilmember Gardner, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question on the peak storage. So obviously the dates are all, generally in the same ballpark. Is that dependent mostly on weather, amount of water usage, or is it kind of all of the above?
Well, it's primarily has to do with our water rights. Most of our water rights, especially on the South Platte Basin, are transferred agricultural rights. So these were this is water that was used for irrigation. So the irrigation season, our June is our best month. In July, we've got a lot of water rights in priority, and then they start to trail off after that. After August, pretty much the irrigation season would have been over, and so we don't have any water to divert after that. So, and I guess it is yes with the weather as well. So we start to increase our consumption a lot in July, right? So we're yielding water, but our consumption is also going up. So it's around that beginning of July period that will peak in what we can actually capture in storage, because we're yielding, but we're also using a lot more as the summer rolls along. You can see sometimes it's been as early as sort of the end of June, but it's also been as late as the end of July. And the later dates would be years where there was a bigger snowpack, and so we were yielding a lot more water in those years longer than so I guess what we look at is the yield outpaced our demand for a longer period of time until summer, rolled along and our water rights sort of trickled off.
So then my Councilmember Lawson, can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, continue.
So on the peak percentage, my kindergarten teacher told me there's no stupid questions, so I'm just going to ask. 73% seems like quite a bit of an outlier. The rest of the peak percentages are all, relatively in a much closer band, whereas 73% is kind of pretty far out there. So my question is, and then that also seems to run counter to the fact that it looks like from the map, the drought conditions improved slightly, at least from June 28th to July 26th statewide. So I'm just curious, what drives that peak percentage, or can you just explain that a little bit more?
Sure. If you look at the next page 3, there's a graph on there, and that maybe more visually kind of shows what's going on. So at the end of the year, so we're going to peak in the summertime for storage, and then after that, we're just using water out of storage all winter long, right? And so we start the year off the next year at whatever we got left in storage, right? And then we'll start yielding it. And so this graph shows the last 5 years along with the current year. And so we've been ending each year lower and lower and lower. So that really dictates kind of.
Okay. Yep, that makes sense. Appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, John, for the presentation and the update. Marshall Brown, item number 3, the consideration to appoint member of the Home State Steering Committee.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. And if you're okay, I'll just do 3 and 4 at the same time because they're very closely related. So with our partnership with Colorado Springs Utilities, we manage the home stake system where we often will go on the water tour. It's a 50-50 partnership at Homestake Reservoir where we each get half of the water coming out of that system. To manage that jointly with Colorado Springs Utilities, we each appoint 3 staff to the Homestake Steering Committee and 3 staff to the Joint Water Authority, each governing body does. And so we've had 3 people on that steering committee for the last little while: Sarah Young, Steve Seba, and Alexandra Davis. It's a 3-year term. Alexandra's term is coming up this year, and we're requesting her reappointment, which she has agreed with, thankfully. So we're requesting that council reappoint Alexandra Davis to both the Homestake Steering Committee and the Joint Water Authority.
Okay, Councilmember Gardner, do you support these recommendations and to move this forward to the city council?
I do, yes.
Okay, and I do too as well. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, item number 5, Sam Miller. Regarding the funding of major drainage wage planning for 4 square mile OSP.
Thank you. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint. Thank you, Water Policy Committee, for hearing me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. I just have one IGA with the Mile High Flood District this month to put before the committee. As I often do with these presentations, I leave a screen up here in the recording for a point of reference about when an intergovernmental agreement would be required with the Mile High Flood District. Today I have a study, a master drainage way plan. Oh, yes, it's a master drainage way plan, specifically an outfall systems plan detailing how the water gets to the main stem channel through tributaries or smaller piped systems. So we study the main stem channel and the stability of the tributary separately. This outfall systems plan will be for the 4 square mile drainage way, which resides primarily out of the city. Typically, when Aurora requests studies with the Mile High Flood District, we request them because it's been 10 years since we studied them last, or development is pushing us to need hydrology for other drainage ways. This was not requested by us, but rather Denver. And because Aurora has a small amount of tributary area within this drainage way, we have been asked to participate in that study, similar to how we would ask others. So the cost sharing mechanism reflects our small portion. If I could advance. Okay. We in the city of Aurora have about 5% of the tributary area going into this drainage way, and so we are sharing 5% of the cost. Mile High Flood District always shares 50%, and then the remaining 100,000 is distributed equally amongst all other municipalities that reside within the drainage way. So this IGA requests $10,000 from Aurora to participate in this study. Does the Water Policy Committee support moving this IGA to study session?
Councilmember Gardner, do you have any questions, and do you support the IGA going to study session?
No questions for me, and yes, I'm okay moving it forward.
Okay, no questions for me, and I also approve it moving forward.
Thank you.
Okay, item number 6. Amended and restated water lease and development agreement for Kings Point, Marshall Brown.
Okay, thank you. We came to council a number of times over the last year to discuss a water lease agreement we had with Kings Point or Oakwood, who had inherited or purchased the right to develop at Kings Point. That water lease agreement had some challenging components, a lot of water use, reliance on groundwater, and an obligation for the city to provide an alternative supply should the groundwater become challenging. So we discussed that again multiple times with council. We put a note on Oakwood's plans for Kings Point that clarified our interpretation of the agreement, and we offered Oakwood an alternative supply to the groundwater when the groundwater would run out, being off of the Prairie Water System, but communicated that they would be responsible for the cost of the water and the infrastructure. They were not very excited about our offer to hook up to the Prairie Water System. So discussions bounced around a little while, and we agreed to enter into mediation to better understand each other's concerns and see if we could reach mutual agreement moving forward. We were able to, after a 13 or 14-hour day, come to agreement on some terms that both parties feel are mutually beneficial for a new water lease agreement. The prior water lease agreement had some obligations or some terms that were being interpreted slightly differently between Oakwood and the city. Regardless of those differences in interpretation, the agreement contemplated potentially going out to 2095 for leasing groundwater, up to 400 acre-feet per year of that groundwater. There was again a difference of opinion on whether the city could refuse to renew the extensions or not. But at the end of the day, what happened is Kings Point came to the table, or Oakwood, and agreed to a very water conscious design of a golf course where they're committing to 250 acre feet of water a year instead of 400, so a significant reduction. There is a caveat in the first 3 years when the turf is being established. They would have the ability to lease up to 350 acre feet. And then for the remaining years in the term of the lease, it would be 250 acre feet a year. If they overwater in any given year, they will commit to use less water the following year. And they also have agreed that the city has no obligation for an alternative supply. Now, in the future, they could still come to the city to discuss an alternative supply, but the city is not on the hook for any costs or obligations associated with that supply. That's how we felt the other agreement was intended to read or really read, and there was a difference of opinion there. But again, we're proposing to replace the old water lease agreement for 400 acre feet a year with 20-year renewable terms out to 2095 with a new water lease agreement for 250 acre feet of groundwater pumping a year out to 2095, but without renewal periods, so they don't have to come back periodically to renew. And then no obligation on the city or the ratepayers to create at the city's cost any alternative supply. If an alternative supply is needed, they would be on the hook for those costs and responsibilities. So it's a simpler agreement. And again, both parties view that it is a much better agreement than what we had before. So,
Sorry,
yeah, so
go ahead, Marshall.
I was going to say in the write-up or the agenda item for the meeting, I did provide a few other details.
Councilmember Gardner, do you have any questions?
So on the reduction from 400 to 250, that's a pretty significant reduction, what, 40% or so. How are they accomplishing that? Is it kind of designing the golf course differently architecturally? Are they using different type of turf? How are they doing that?
Yeah, a combination of things. So careful selection of turf, very meticulous design of the fairways and greens, incorporating sands and really healthy soils for the turf. And then the peripheral areas around the greens and the fairways are being designed with warm season plants or more native plants, xeriscape around the perimeter. So they're doing a combination of things to get down to the 250. You're right. It is best of my knowledge, it could be the most water-wise golf course in the West after they're done at the level of course they're trying to design and implement.
Yeah. Well, that's why I pointed out, because the level of course what they're trying to build, that's a pretty significant reduction. And so what I was curious about, it doesn't sound like they are, I don't know, sacrificing the integrity of what they're trying to build. They're just going to do it in a little bit different way, but they're still going to build the same kind of caliber and quality of golf course, which is great for Aurora.
Yeah, they definitely were interested and committed to the highest level of golf. and course design out there, and have just implemented again all the best practices for water use into the course. So it'll probably, they shared a kind of a, I don't think they have the design totally done, but they shared a draft layout, and it may have a few, it won't have cottonwood trees around it. It'll have lower water use trees and vegetation. So it may look a little different from some of the other courses, but the level of play and the fairways and the greens and the course design itself are going to be, they're striving for a PGA level course.
Yeah. Well, I'm an admitted golf course architecture nerd, and they so far will not tell me who the architect is, but they say it's somebody who I will know. So I'm really excited. So hopefully once we get this lease done, we can, that information can become public.
Yeah, I agree. I'm excited to see what they're able to accomplish out there as well. And again, I saw a mock-up. It looked fantastic, but it'll be fun as the details come out for sure.
I have a question, Marshall, but I'm going to turn the meeting back over to Councilmember Sundberg. I see he's on, so welcome back, Councilmember Sundberg.
Well, thank you,
We're
Angela. Would you like to keep going with it?
Oh.
Set your feet around the ground here.
I'll give it back to you. We're on item 6. I just have a question for Marshall.
Okay. Okay.
Marshall, one of the things I know this is a contractual agreement that we have, but you stated in one of your comments that if they use more water in 1 year or so, then they will reduce it in the next year. How do we know that? Who's monitoring that?
Yeah, great question. So they're required to report to the state all their groundwater pumping every year, and then they're committed to share that with us. And we went a little further and we asked for initially monthly data, and what we settled on is quarterly data. So the agreement itself obligates them to provide that data to us on a quarterly basis. And then the state requires it on an annual basis, is my understanding. I know the state requires it. I'm 90% sure it's on an annual basis. And then the states also, they're required to comply with all the state metering and monitoring and calibration requirements as well.
And then just a second question, part B to that. So if there is some issues where they're finding either the state or the city is finding that they're not meeting those, what happens? What happens to the agreement? Do you have to go to court? What happens if there's some, I know I'm not saying that they're not going to follow it, but I'm just asking what would be the ramifications if there's a continuation of enforcement is not done on that, or we're doing enforcement, but they're not complying, and it's a consistent situation where they're not meeting the guidelines. So.
Yeah, good question again. So there's a couple of things built into the agreement. The first is they've committed in year 2 to reduce their pumping, but your question's more long-term.
Right.
The other kind of more short-term thing built into the agreement is they've agreed to pay a 5 times multiplier on top of their rate in any year they exceed their pumping. So the agreement is set up to give them a little bit of flexibility from 1 year to the next year. In the longer term, if they violate multiple years in a row, they would be in breach of contract and the contract would go away.
Got it. Okay.
So, but they did, by agreeing to those other 2 terms and sharing, again, kind of the conceptual design on the golf course, they have indicated that they're pretty serious about the commitment and they really think that they can do this. So we were excited about that.
Okay.
But multiple years in a row, the agreement would be breached.
Okay. Thank you, Marshall.
Yep.
Thank you, Councilmember Lawson. Does that conclude item 6?
Yes, it does.
Okay, forgive me, everyone. I'm at a Starbucks. This is not the Botanical Gardens behind me. There was a groundbreaking of Walden 35, which is an affordable housing project through the Aurora Housing Authority and the city and multiple partners. The governor was there and the mayor. And so here I am in a kind of a loud Starbucks, but thank you. And I want to say congratulations on the Kings Point negotiations to the water department. And I want to say congratulations to you all on the passing of the ordinance, the conservation ordinance. And I know you worked very long and hard and patiently on that matter. So congrats. So item number 7, Marshall, Water Conservation Memorandum of Understanding.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the congratulations. I also should note thank you to you three, council members Sundberg, Gardner, and Lawson, for your support and amendments. At the end of the day, I think what we ended up with was a little bit better than what we took into the night. And so thank you for your support on the conservation ordinance. Related to that is item 7 on this agenda. We have been working for the last few weeks on a memorandum of understanding with Front Range water providers, and it's growing a little bit. But the memorandum of understanding, I included the key points of that memorandum of understanding that we're working on in this agenda. The main thing it commits us to, really, there's nothing new in the memorandum of understanding outside of what Aurora is already doing, with one exception. And this came up multiple times in discussions on the ordinance that we just passed, including the evening that ordinance was approved. This commits us to a 30% reduction in non-functional turf looking back. So that is a big deal. Now, again, we were headed there anyway, Aurora, but we have not put that in a plan yet. This memorandum of understanding would commit us right now. The concept is within the next 6 months to have a plan put together that shows how we're going to accomplish a 30% reduction in non-functional turf in existing areas of the city. And we got a lot of feedback from council as we went through that process with the ordinance that, hey, what are we going to do looking back? Well, this is the first big step in creating that plan. And this memorandum of understanding right now is being drafted for, again, Front Range municipal water providers to sign on. So the parties who have been working on this are Denver Water, Aurora Water, Colorado Springs Utilities, Pueblo Water, Northern Water, and the Southeastern Conservancy District, along with some discussions with Southern Nevada Water Authority, so Las Vegas, and Metropolitan Water in California. So the idea with this memorandum is to start with a signatory group of maybe 6 or 8 parties, including Aurora, and then invite water providers throughout the West, throughout the Colorado River Basin, to join everybody in this challenge and sign on. So it's moving fairly quickly, associated with a couple of things: the Colorado River shortage, the Bureau's request for people to come up with tangible action items to save water, and the governor's office reaching out to municipalities or municipal water providers and saying, hey, what can you commit to? So right now, it looks like after this memorandum comes out, the governor's office may pick up on it and run a little bit with the invitation to others to sign on as well. So we wanted to come here. The memorandum's not completely drafted yet. It's still bouncing around a little bit. But again, I copied the key points and included in the commentary. Our request, though, because of timing and the lack of a study session for the next month, would be that when we get this drafted, we would come and share the details, the exact language, on the 26th when we have the water tour, and then take it to the floor directly after that meeting on the 26th.
I have a question, Marshall. Does something like this help satisfy the federal government's demands for restrictions?
Yes, very much so. That's a lot of what's been driving the conversation, has been the need to satisfy the Bureau, the federal government, and the governor's office's desired response to the federal government. Those are the two main drivers. So, and we felt that it aligned very well with what Aurora has been doing and what we were planning to continue to do.
And does this include, say, parks, recreation, and open space within that 30% for our city?
It does, yes, absolutely. So our plan, our 6-month plan, will have to be created in conjunction with PROS, with Parks, Rec, and Open Space. And most of the low-hanging fruit is going to be in the public spaces, like around the AMC, medians, curbside landscapes, peripheral areas around parks. So that'll be a lot of what we target initially. And I should have mentioned for the MOU, there's not necessarily a date. It just commits us to coming up with a plan, and within the plan, a 30% reduction in non-functional turf. But it doesn't have a date. So our plan, what we need to do will be to follow up likely with Water Policy Committee and Parks to create a plan that looks out over maybe like 10 years and comes up with specific targets, associated budgets, grants, etc., to support the goal.
Great. Anything else on this or questions from council members?
Yeah, I have questions. So I'm trying to think where to start. I am frustrated because when the water conservation ordinance was at study session, you know, there was the comment made, well, we need to do this, otherwise we're going to have to increase water rates. And then 2 days later, there's a proposal in front of water committee to increase water rates. A lot of the skepticism that I heard from the community over the water conservation ordinance was, well, they're coming for our lawns next. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, or a week and a half later, or whatever, we're apparently going to be going for people's lawns that are already existing. And I understand the water need of it, but I don't think there is a recognition of the political reality here, as well as the financial burden that something like this will place on residents. You know, I was frustrated about the water conservation ordinance because I felt like it put most of the burden on home buyers. I think the city is frankly probably the biggest hypocrite when it comes to water usage in the city, in terms of, you know, large areas of emerald green grass. My grass at my house is not nearly as green as the great lawn outside of City Hall, for example. And that goes for parks and for, you know, police stations, fire stations. I could go on and on of city facilities and the beautiful, deep, lush green grass that they have. And it's frustrating to me now. We're apparently going to be going towards backwards facing, and I don't know how that's going to be paid for. I mean, I for one am not going to vote to place the burden of the cost on taxpayers in Aurora, whether it's businesses or residents, you know, because grants from the government still come from taxpayers. And so I guess I'm not sure how we're even going to pay for this. What I would prefer to do, though it sounds like this is a region-wide thing, and so my opinion probably doesn't really matter a whole lot, is, you know, why doesn't the city start by, you know, cleaning up its own house, so to speak? Let's start removing grass. I mean, we have quite a few facilities around the city, like I said, with emerald green grass. Why are we continuing to place the burden on, you know, homeowners? Now it's going to be businesses that aren't going to have the money to pay for this. We are, and I understand the timeline is not going to be set in stone. It sounds like it's going to be, you know, several years, a decade, whatever. But we are, you know, entering a recession. Costs are going up significantly, and with inflation, I mean, it just, and then we're going to burden businesses and homeowners, it sounds like, with reducing
We're not.
turf.
So first, and I clearly didn't explain well enough or in enough detail. So the first spaces we're going after are exactly what you just described. We are not envisioning this plan mandating single-family residences or businesses get rid of their turf. What the plan will focus on is all the space that I just mentioned. So curbside landscapes, medians, public spaces around city parks, the non-functional turf in all of those spaces is what will absolutely be targeted with this plan. Now, What we're also planning is to enhance our voluntary rebate programs. And the voluntary rebate programs would play a role in this program as well. But again, the key there is voluntary. So those voluntary programs right now are in high demand. We're being inundated by residents who would like to remove their turf, by businesses who would like to remove non-functional turf. And so the concept with this plan is to enhance those voluntary programs. At the same time, we clean up our own house, as you put it, to go into the common areas, the medians. I can't even, do you guys drive down Buckley Road? Because that is insane. We need to get rid of all of that. Absolutely, you're right. Before we ever even think about, which we're not, telling residents you have to remove your turf. So that will be what we're targeting. And at the same time, enhancing our voluntary programs. And between those two things, 30% is easily attainable if we target non-functional turf. So we do not envision that this 10-year plan will look at any mandatory requirements on personal property. It'll be voluntary. And we do have, with the voluntary programs now, people can do that and offset a significant portion of their costs. We do anticipate offsetting even more of those costs through a combination of various things. So our cheapest water that we acquire right now, well, and it's not really an acquisition, but water we save through our conservation programs costs less than water we have to go, water rights we acquire and systems we develop. And so that's where the funding would come from for the voluntary programs. The grants, some of those were already out there. And the state approved, I think it was $4 million in this space this year. And we've already had the state ask us to please submit an application to access some of that funding. So some of the funding is already there for the grant programs. So you're absolutely right. I think we're more in alignment than you were thinking, Curtis.
Okay. Well, and I agree on the voluntary stuff. I mean, if we have sources of funding for residents or for businesses to reduce the amount of turf and or remove, I think we should encourage that. So I agree with that point of it. So to make sure I understand though, if we add up and maybe I'm misunderstanding what the 30% reduction means, but how I'm interpreting it is if we add up all the grass in the city, 30% let me think how to ask this medians and public spaces and common areas and city facilities would make up 30% of that grass? Because that seems really high.
No, good question. And again, I didn't explain really well. So when we took the conservation ordinance forward, we essentially defined what non-functional means in the city. So first, we take all the cool season turf and we subtract backyards because they're considered functional. We subtract sports fields, social areas, all the programmed areas. We subtract all of that. Then what's left is what we would consider non-functional turf. And out of the non-functional turf, what this is committing us to is to reduce that by 30%. So we think, or I think I should say, I think we can do a lot better than 30% over 10 years after we back out all the functional turf. So 30% is a very attainable goal, which is one of the reasons I was saying for this, we're not going to have to do anything mandatory in the private property space, just voluntary there. But it's because of the way we're calculating the non-functional and the 30%. So
gotcha. And that will be the same definition used by other municipalities as well that sign on to it?
Not necessarily. Good question. So the ordinance or the MOU itself does not define non-functional. It allows each community to define non-functional for themselves. So for us, we've defined it. Las Vegas has defined it. Many of the other signatories or entities that are contemplating signing haven't even defined non-functional yet. So they're going to have to start there.
Great. All right. Thanks, Marshall. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good questions. Thank you.
A quick technical question on the removal of this turf. Has the city invested in turf removing machines in an additional manner to make this efficient and a little more speedy?
Yeah, another good question. So far, what we've been doing is contracting most of that out. So we will, though, and we've had some preliminary discussions with pros already. As we define the plan, we're going to have to then figure out how to optimize the expenditures. And so whether some of that work comes in-house or whether it remains contracted, we're not sure yet, but we will have to figure that out.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions on item number 7?
Councilmember Sundberg, just
Yes.
a comment, well, not a comment, but just a question to Marshall. So as we develop the plan, and that will continue to come back to the Water Policy Committee based on the development, is that correct?
Correct. We'd like to do two things. So we have the Water Policy Committee, and what we would like to propose staff is that we come back here with the plan updates of how that plan's being drafted. The other committee we have is the Citizen Water Advisory Committee that originally, my understanding, it was created before I got here. So Greg, correct me if I say anything that's wrong, but it was created during times of drought and stress and strain previously to provide feedback and comments on what kind of things the city might want to do. So I think our other proposal might be that we engage the Citizen Water Advisory Committee, do some public communication also associated with that committee to see if there are other members of the public. We always have seats available every year, and really re-engage that, similar to how the committee was used historically to get feedback from the public as we move this plan forward as well.
Okay, so there may be a kind of a civic engagement with the public on this plan. A component.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And then Councilmember Sundberg, I need to go back. I think I did something from the last item. Marshall, were we supposed to move that forward and approve item 6? And I don't think I did that from a procedural standpoint.
Yeah, we do need to move that one forward, yes.
Okay, so Councilmember Sundberg, we probably need to go back to 6 because I did not do that, so I apologize.
Okay, thank you. After discussion on 6 earlier, is there consensus that we move that forward? Any opposition?
No opposition from me.
And Councilmember Gardner, fine.
None for me either.
Okay, thank you so much. And have we concluded item 7 then? And is that something that needs to go before council, item number 7?
It will. Again, and we're proposing something slightly different there. We're proposing to take or to distribute to council the exact language ahead of the water tour on the 26th of August, and then take it straight to the floor after the opportunity to have a discussion and answer questions at the 26th water tour.
Thank you for that clarification. I remember now. And then on the 26th, are both council members Lawson and Gardner going to be in attendance on the tour?
I've signed up for it.
I am unsure. I'm getting knee surgery on the 29th, and so I'm trying to get as much done as I can before then. So I'm not quite sure yet.
Okay, thank you. All right, so item number 7 will move forward in that unique fashion. And if we could please hear from Greg Baker on the drought stage update, item 8.
Well, thank you for giving us the time here. I also have Lauren Maggart here to update you on where we stand in drought. In April, we came to water policy and talked about the process as we go from monitoring our water supply and advancing any potential stages, as well as the water management plan, which is our demand management function. At this point, as you probably heard from in your discussion with John Murphy, and then especially with Marshall on the conservation ordinance, we are concerned about where we stand right now. Our reservoirs are not as robust as we'd like them to be, and demand has been very high in spite of this monsoonal rain we've had the past couple of days. So we'd like to kind of give you an update to where we stand right now and what we may be looking for the rest of this year or early into next year. So I've asked Lauren to join us and let her ask her to present on the supply and where we stand today. Lauren, are you there? You look like you're muted.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Greg. And yeah, so I was going to share a few updates about where we're at with drought for the city of Aurora. This kind of building on what John presented earlier today. And so yesterday I was working on some of this as we were getting pouring rain outside. So that was really great that we got all that rain. It'll help our local grass and parks green up a little bit. But unfortunately, it probably will just reduce demand just a little bit. But we're still down in our reservoirs, and demands are will probably still jump up once the rain stops again. I'm looking across the state. We have seen a lot of improvement in the drought monitor, especially in the Front Range Mountains. You can see that white area. But Aurora, the city of Aurora, where all our residents are, we're still showing D2 severe drought where our city is. And in our collection system in the Upper Ark and the Colorado Basin and Upper South Platte, we're still seeing between abnormal to moderate drought in those regions. And this shows a change in drought over the last 4 weeks since July 12th to August 9th. So you can see around Aurora in the South Platte area, it has gotten worse. But we have seen a lot of improvement in southern Colorado, but unfortunately that's not where our water comes from. But we are getting a lot of rain in the Front Range in the south, but we're still seeing quite a bit of drought in the plains area where we live. Now I'm going to show the snowpack over our 3 basins, South Platte, Arkansas, and Colorado, and how that did this year. Unfortunately, all 3 basins were below average. South Platte it didn't look that bad, but it actually was the worst yield that we got out of our system this year. It didn't start out very well. We got quite a bit of snow in early January, and then it kind of just slowed down and was below average through March into May, and then melted out a little bit early. We had some rain in that late May, early June timeframe, but overall the snowpack was not at average this year. And then Arkansas also was below average, but interestingly enough, I'll show you later, our yields did do pretty well in the Arkansas because we have pretty senior water rights in the Arkansas. But it started out below average and stayed pretty much below average the whole year. And then the Colorado had a similar look to the South Platte. It started out a little low. We got some snow in early January, and then it melted out pretty early this year. And our Colorado yields this year were at average, but we also have very senior water rights in the Colorado Basin. So rainfall over the state since October. So this is how we measure our water year from October through the end of September. So this is showing most of the mountains have been doing pretty well with rainfall, around the 90 to 130 percentile. However, in the South Platte, in the plains where we live, it's been below, but we have gotten that blip of rain recently, which is great. So we'll get a little closer to average, but we might not quite get to normal with this recent rainfall. But we'll have to see how this updates. And then the 3-month outlook, unfortunately, is showing below average for precipitation and also warm. So we're looking at warm and dry, looking out in the next 3 months. So that's August, September, October. And this is soil moisture. This is a little older. This is back in late July. Across the state, it's kind of hit or miss. It's pretty spotty. It was really bad a few months ago, so we have seen a bit of an improvement in soil moisture. It's not that great in the South Platte, but in the mountains, it's hit or miss. All right, now going into storage. So this is updated as of just a few days ago. We're at 68%. So John had mentioned we peaked at 73% of storage. So now we're starting to draw down that storage. So we finished most of our yield. So now we're drawing on that storage to meet demands across the city. So we'll continue to see this decrease until we get yield next year. And this is an interesting graph I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. This is our system storage since 1987 going out to present day. If you can see, since about 2016, every year has peaked a little bit lower than the last one. And we're starting to see that our storage isn't quite getting back up to full. We haven't had a really wet year in the last few years. And so we're getting pretty concerned about this trend line. And I wanted to show where we peaked this year was at 73%. That was around 113,600 acre feet. And looking back, we haven't peaked that low since the last drought of 2012, 2013. You can see we were really low then. Looking back, we had a bad year in 2002, and it took quite a few years for us to get back to full. So because of this low stage, we're getting very concerned about where our system is. And if next year ends up being another averagey low year, we're going to be even further down. So we really need a very wet year this year or a little bit above average to start getting back up to full. This is the last 5 years. This is one of the graphs that John shares. The purple is 2022. So you can see we're significantly below where we've been in the last 5 years, only just above 110. And so next year we're gonna keep going down, and next year we're gonna be even lower if we have another low to average year. And this is distribution. The black line is average. You can see since early May, we've been distributing more than average. We had a few times where it went below average. We had some rainfall in early August. It dipped down. Probably with this rain, we're going to see another dip, but I expect it's going to just jump right back up once it gets warm again. So we're distributing a little bit higher than average. So that means we're using a little bit more water. Okay, jumping back, this is what we updated a forecast model to help with drought planning. This is what we were projecting back on May 1st. What we actually saw is that our storage did not quite meet what we forecasted. We were a little bit below. What actually happened was a little bit below forecast. The brown line was looking like we'd be closer to 115,000 acre feet, but we only got to 113. So we're pretty close, but a little bit below. And then this is showing our yields as of August 1st. We expect to yield a little bit more water than what I'm showing, but this is as up to date as we have right now. The gray bar is average from 2003 to 2021. The blue, darker blue is what we forecasted, and the lighter blue is actual to date as of August, actually August 2nd. So South Platte, we've only yielded 25,000. That is 57% of average. So we are not doing very great on the South Platte. The Arkansas, we've yielded 14,000. That is only 70% of average. The Colorado Basin did really well, but we're still only at 95%. So overall, we've yielded 57,500, and that overall is about 69% of average. So this is one of the major reasons we are not seeing that storage jump back up. Yield just wasn't that great this year. So it's concerning. So I'll turn this back over to Greg, and he can talk about what our drought action team's thinking about watering restrictions.
Thank you. Before we get into that, were there any questions for Lauren regarding where we stand right now for water supply?
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
Lauren, Councilmember Sundberg, I just have a question for Lauren.
Yes, please, go ahead.
So in these particular forecasts, I was reviewing them. Where does, and I know we're looking at storage, and I could be off base on this, but how do we look at these forecasts based on the growth that we're seeing now and in the future? Like, is there any outlier in these particular forecasts that you're doing that considers that as well?
So the forecast that I'm showing you is for near term. We're not looking at growth for this.
Okay.
There's some other work I do that we do look at that, but for this exact one, we're just looking at the next year, 12 to 24 months out. 12 months is a little bit more accurate than 24 months.
Okay.
So this is we're forecasting what next year's demands will be. We look at what our current storage levels are, and then we forecast what we're going to yield over that next year. And it's like a mass balance equation to calculate what the reservoirs will do.
Sundberg, can I just, okay, so I understand that what that's about. So we are building and that, so we're gonna have more water users, which kind of plays into this forecast. I'm not the expert, I'm just, so this has nothing to do, I know it doesn't have anything to do with growth, but we are building now within the year. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out how does that, there's no calculation of that, of what potential users or what users who are already living in some of these houses are using in water. Does that make sense? I'm just asking if that's even within the year, because we're building now.
Yeah,
I mean, there's people
yeah.
that are living
Yeah.
in these homes now.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're using pretty simple estimates for what our demand will be over the next 12 years. But on a separate note, we're working on master planning where we're looking at what that growth is going to be in 10, 20, 100 years.
Okay.
Let me respond a little clarification on that. This is really is a snapshot in time for today, but what we're looking at ultimately is council's goals to us that we always maintain 3-year supply in storage when possible. So we're looking, when we look at our water supply today and how it impacts our water management plan, we are looking mostly at that ability to meet that 3 years demand. The fortunate thing about growth is even though it is happening, and it seems like it's happening very fast, it is happening at a percent or 1.3% increase. So we're not seeing a tremendous increase in our water demands. And matter of fact, they've been flat over time. They are climbing again because of that growth, and we're watching that. That is impacting us a bit, but it's not going to have a substantial impact over the next 3 years. So, but that's also why we need, and what we'll talk about obviously on the 26th is what do we need to do to meet that growth in those 3, 5, 10-year spans.
The question, Councilmember Lawson. Please proceed if any other questions or. Lauren, and are you finished?
If there aren't any more questions for Lauren, let me kind of take the next step, which is you can see we are concerned. We are evaluating in-house. What is our next step? What do the drought action team monitors our supply and its ability to meet demand. And we're getting concerned we're not able to meet again that 3-year policy reserve. The water management plan, as you may remember from the April presentation, breaks up our water availability stages based upon months of supply available. And so where we're in right now is normal, which would be 30 months to 36 months of supply available. We're right on the fringe of that 30-month availability. And as both Lauren and John pointed out, from here it's kind of a downward cycle in our water availability because we're not yielding. We have a little more yield in some systems, but it's not going to be substantial. With the 90-degree days we've had, it's really drawn us down quite a bit. So the discussion in-house is what is the next step? And the next step would probably be a request to council, and we would come to council for a resolution to change that water availability stage. The first stage in the water management plan is stage 1. That would be 2-day per week restriction for residential. That would be based upon address. We haven't done that since 2013. So there's a certain great deal of communication need to go out. We're discussing the timing on how that would look. This might be an unusual year where we might want to ask for a declaration of drought 1 stage in January. Rather, traditionally, we again went with April or May through September, our traditional irrigation season. But as you learned in April, it's difficult to give that projection at that time because we don't know how our yields are going to play out completely. We don't know that until June or July, and by that time, it's probably a little too late to actually ramp up a stage effectively. So we're discussing whether to come forward with a declaration that would begin in January. Obviously, nobody's watering at that time, let alone 2 days or 3 days a week, but it gives us a lot of time for that rollout, for that education. So we're not contradicting some messages we gave before. If you get, we get that watering mailing that we send out in April to every customer, you got that large chart that showed you how you should water, we didn't want to then be in contradiction with that. So this gives us the opportunity to get that communications out and ramp it up and encourage further conservation and give our customers a base of how this would roll out. Plus, there's a lot of education needs to go on, especially those with anybody with a smart controller, a Rachi or something like that. You have to learn how to use that and program appropriately so that you can at least maintain a relatively healthy lawn. We also have to set the expectation about what that looks like under 2-day-a-week versus 3-day-a-week restrictions. You're no longer talking about the vernacular of a lush lawn. You're talking about keeping your lawn healthy, and you're talking about it may have to go dormant if we end up with a summer like we did this year, where we had weeks and weeks of 90-degree days. You have to accept that a certain amount of dormancy may be acceptable. That doesn't kill grass. It simply means that your grass has reacted to heat the way it would in nature and simply go dormant. So we have to get that messaging queued up. We have to get that education, which is fairly substantial, because again, it's one of those things we seem to do it on a 10-year basis. So we want to make sure we're prepared for that. Again, this isn't, I don't think, we're not requesting that an action today on this. This is for education information only, but we want you to be aware of it. And of course, we're engaging with CWAC as well on this, so that if we get to that stage, if we don't see a vast improvement here, it's highly likely we may have to go to that next year step. One other thing I want to point out is we've talked about the rains we've had the past couple of weeks, monsoonal rains. There are two types of droughts. There is a hydrologic drought, and that is measured in the inches of precipitation. So we may actually look fairly normal based upon that. And then there's an agricultural drought, and that's what affects your turf, because the water as it comes out, especially the storms we had last week, which is so incredibly heavy, that simply rolled off. That didn't, it may have had a 1 or 2 day impact on your grass, but it doesn't have a long-term impact because it didn't have a chance to soak in. The one yesterday actually was very good for that, but again, that's the first time we've seen rain like that in many months. So how long that impact is going to be, it's not going to be that long. So people just need to expect that. So if we don't, we will see an uptick again in watering after this week. So it's going to be a demand. It's going to draw down our reservoirs again. So based upon that, I mean, again, there isn't an action request here, but we simply want this for information item only. But do you have any questions for us regarding that?
Well, I have a quick question, if you wouldn't mind me interrupting. So internally, you're speaking about a possible stage change. If that did occur, are we looking at next year that you would bring that before council, or is it still a possibility this year?
It would probably be next year. One thing that the water management plan does is it at certain stages it has some drought surcharges. It becomes an incentive for outdoor use reduction at certain levels. And so we want to fine tune those a bit. We looked at them and we think there's some room for improvement. So that would be actually part of the rate ordinance, which would take effect January 1st. So it would be something we would bring to you probably maybe end of December for effect January 1st, or we could bring it in January and come into effect any time shortly after that. So, but yeah, at this point, because we're kind of in a downhill slide, it really takes about a month to ramp up communications, get that education out there, get the enforcement capabilities out there with our water monitors as well. We wouldn't probably see a substantial benefit by doing it any earlier. We get it effectively in place by October, which doesn't help us a whole lot.
Greg, questions, council members?
Councilmember Sundberg.
Yes.
Do we have an ordinance requiring the installation of rain sensors either for new construction or new permitted irrigation systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, we do. We've had it in place at least in 2005. One thing, and we've been talking in house, we need to ramp up this communication. A lot of rain sensors don't work. They have about a 5-year life cycle, because they use a little ceramic disc, and that expands in moisture, and that's actually what triggers the sensor. And then I know my HOA, for example, yesterday was watering in the afternoon, which I wasn't too
That's
happy.
that's exactly why I asked. 'Cause driving around town yesterday, I saw all kinds of sprinklers going off, and it
Yes,
just
yes.
made me wonder that. So
Yeah. Now, one thing about rain sensors is they're quite often triggered by a half an inch of precipitation, which is actually quite a bit of precipitation. So if you get these smaller events, and I know even though it was great yesterday, it was actually very spotty. I was driving around Aurora, my home. I live in Hilliard South, which is Yale and 225. They got much less than they did up here at the AMC. So it's possible that they didn't get that half-inch threshold. The other thing is weather-based controllers and will use localized weather data because now so many homes have these Wi-Fi based weather systems at their home and they're linking them up the networks that are accessible. So a weather-based controller like a Rachio or a Rainbird will actually pull that localized data so it knows what happens in your general area and isn't relying upon the National Weather Service station, which is a DIA and not effective at all for us here. So that will also do the same thing. It will recognize that you probably don't need to water because of the what's called the plant water requirement. They don't make that calculation for you. So that helps too. But yes, the rain sensors have been in place, requirement has been in place for a long time. It's just a question of people monitoring them, making sure that they're in the appropriate place, make sure they work. So we're going to ramp that up. After yesterday, I said we have to ramp up our outreach on that one pretty dramatically. So.
yeah, well, that's you and I had the same conclusion. That's what I was thinking is
Mhm.
what kind of communications, marketing, outreach could we do to make sure people are either, installing them or maintaining them? Because it sounds like the maintaining them is the biggest thing because the lifespan. I'm guessing a lot of people put them in when they install their irrigation system and then don't ever think about it again. So
It could be 15 years old, and we do rebate
yeah.
for those. They're relatively cheap. So we do rebate 100% of the cost. So it's just the installation side of it. So it's awareness.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Anything else you'd like to add to item number 8?
Not at this time. Like I said, we'll probably come back at one of the later meetings with a further update. We'll try to keep you
Okay.
abreast of where we stand on the water availability. So
Thank you for the information.
thank you.
And thank you, Lauren, as well. Item number 9, Greg, please continue.
Okay. This is something that came up at a study session, I believe, at in February. So and I guess I want to confirm because WebEx is kind of a strange beast here. Are you seeing my slide as a full screen at this point? Okay. Okay. So there's a lot of questions on service lines that water and sewer service lines. It comes up quite often at ward meetings. It comes up a lot on Nextdoor if you follow them on that. So we want to kind of show you what we have for outreach on that and help you with understand the delineations and the services that are available to help property owners with service line issues. And just for a straight definition, service line is really that portion of the infrastructure that connects a property or business, business of a home or a building to the city's infrastructure. But there are two different points of delineation that I want to point out. For sewer, it is from the building to the sewer main, which is traditionally in the street, sometimes in an alley in the older sections of town. But it is literally to the point that it reaches it in the street. For water, that delineation is to the water meter pit, which is most often in a front yard, and again, can be in an alley. And in some older areas, it can actually be in what's called the curbside. That's very rare, but it does happen. So there are 2 points of delineation here. If the service line from either the meter for water or from the sewer main for sewer is a responsibility of the property owner, and that's by ordinance. That ordinance has been in place, but for a long time. It is considered premise plumbing. It's considered the same as the plumbing inside the house at that point. The challenge here is that quite often homeowners' insurances do not recognize buried infrastructure in their policies. So the cost of replacement on these can sometimes be fairly exorbitant. Let's talk about the materials here first before we get too far into this. The bigger challenge here is always sewer. Sewer service lines or laterals, there's another term for them, for many years were made of vitrified clay. It's actually a very good material, still used in the South, especially where you don't have a lot of soil shifting due to weather conditions. It is a clay. It is brittle, so it can crack. And when it cracks, quite often it can release gases and moisture that actually attract tree roots. Question we quite often get is, why do we require trees if they're going to impact my sewer system? In fact, the dynamic is the opposite. The sewer system attracted the tree roots in Colorado rarely exceed 2 feet deep in depth. So for them to go to 6 to 8 feet down to find a sewer system means that they were attracted by a broken pipe. There were varying insulation methods, especially in the early days, since it is clay. I know in the 50s, quite often contractors would simply go with a hammer, break open a main, and put the sewer main in. That was the extent of what they did. So there was a big gap in there. So lots of challenges with clay. We don't permit clay anymore for that reason. They haven't since the early 80s. The more common material now is PVC. It's not brittle, has a very long life. I'm not certain we know the full life of it. It's also glued, so it doesn't have the fittings that a clay pipe does, so it has less challenges. Most homes built since the mid 80s have PVC pipe. On water, there are multiple materials that have been used. Right now, copper is our standard in our engineering manual. That is what's required, SB type K copper. But there have been several other materials, all which have their own challenges. Obviously, lead, and you've heard quite a bit about our lead programs in the past. We're fortunate that we don't have that many here, and we're right now working again to remove as many of those as possible. Galvanized iron was used in quite a few homes. I know my son had rented a house in Indiana when he was in school that had galvanized pipe, and let's just say it was really challenging because it corroded from the inside. So he often had flakes of rust clogging up everything. Plus, if they're used in conjunction with a lead service line, it will actually retain that lead. So there are challenges with that. PVC was used for a while from the 60s until the 80s. This is a white PVC versus the darker PVC or heavier PVC that's used in sewer. A bigger challenge with PVC in Aurora was that contractors quite often left it sitting out and exposed it to the sun during construction, and so it became very brittle. For the most part, I think most PVC service lines at this point have identified themselves by breaking. So we don't come across those too often. And again, copper is a very long life material. It'll probably outlast all of us here. So when it comes to a service line challenge, when it breaks or it leaks, and it is the homeowner's responsibility to repair it, this is where we quite often get surprises because most people did not understand that these are not covered by the standard portion of a homeowner's insurance policy. It is buried infrastructure. However, many insurance companies will offer a rider. And so we are pursuing an education plan right now to let everybody know to check with their insurance company. These riders typically cost $6 to $7 a month. But the repair on a service line, depending on how large the break is and how far it has to go, can be upwards of $10,000 to $12,000. A sewer service line, for example, since it has to go into the street, requires a street cut. So that adds a substantial cost. You can do point repairs on some of these, but and some of these policies will cover those point repairs. But if you've had a complete failure of a clay pipe, sometimes the best thing to do is replace it from end to end. So it's important that our customers know about these options. If an insurance company, a homeowner insurance company, does not cover these options, first of all, we recommend that they maybe check with other insurance companies because these are probably the safest and policies. They already work with their homeowners insurance on multiple levels and they understand the needs there. But there are third-party providers, and quite often we'll get direct mail solicitations. The two most prominent on those are HomeServe USA and American Water Resources. They will provide these services from anywhere from $7 a year to $12 a year based upon the location and based upon what they're covering. Sewer service lines quite often are much more expensive because they're more prone to breakage. Water service lines, especially if you have copper, you may never see one. And so those costs, they're glad to take your money because they know they'll probably never pay out a claim on that. We do not advertise these private service line plans, but we do at least tell people how they can find them. And this comes on a challenge with the city. We cannot endorse a commercial plan. So how do we get people to the right place without that endorsement? So what we've done is we have developed a web page that helps guide homeowners in these. The biggest thing we do when we get outreach from a customer on what they should do about service line, first thing they need to do is determine how old their service line is and what it's made of. And that's challenging because it is buried. But quite often we give some guidance on our website. For example, if you know your house was built after 1985, you have PVC sewer and you have copper for water. So you're probably safe. Talking to your neighbors, knowing what they have. Quite often you have a neighbor who had to replace one a while back. That helps with that history. We understand a little bit in the history around Aurora now, especially with our lead service line program. That's given us quite a bit of history on what exists where, what developers back in the 50s and 60s use what materials. So we can get some guidance on that as well. The biggest thing I think most people can do, especially with the sewer service line, is they can have it videotaped, and you see these services offered. It is worth $100 if you have any question on it. If you're buying a new house, for example, or buying a used house here, to have it TV'd. They put a small TV camera, fiber optic TV camera down the line. Again, this only works for sewer. It doesn't work for water for many reasons. But it works for sewer. They can actually check out the line from end to end, and they can get a DVD of this. If there seems to be any problem associated with it, they can contact Aurora Water, and we'll have our staff go through the DVD with the property owner, and we will confirm what the plumber is saying here. So there's a little bit of comfort in that. These services typically are $100 to $150. It is probably the cheapest thing you can do. It identifies not only what the material is, what the condition is. You could have an old clay line and it could be in perfectly fine shape. If you have tree roots, it can identify how they're intruding upon it, and there's anything to be done there. If there are dips in the line, and that's something you might, that's a point where you do a point to repair rather than replacing a line, you simply repair that dip. That can be easily identified. So some very simple methods just to identify up front. When it comes to these sewer coverages, again, we say if you have a clay line, you may benefit from this sort of coverage. If you have PVC, that's a question of how, it's a risk mitigation. How much risk are you willing to take on versus the cost? So, and again, with water, as I keep saying, if it's anything other than copper, you may want to consider it. The other three materials I mentioned are very short-lived. If you have copper, again, your risk mitigation, but it's going to be there for a long time. So I talked about the education portion of this. It's been a little while since we pushed out anything on this, so I understand I will be using News Aurora and our social media channels and TV8 as well on this. To talk once again, but we need to engage more on this discussion. But we also have a very robust website. So if you get these questions, point people to auroragov.org/service lines. There is even a brochure for Homeowner's Guide to Sewers. We also have a Spanish version available on the website. But this event effectively lists everything we've talked about here. Where do your points of delineation start and stop? What you should look for? How can you plan for this? And then what services are available as well. So with that, I guess I'll ask if there are any questions. If you've had any interaction, especially with constituents who have had these challenges, anything we can do to help.
Any questions from council members? Well, I know what it's like to have tree roots, and I guess you can pour a little bit of some type of a substance down there to fight them back, right?
Well, that's a copper sulfate, and we don't recommend that.
To the water supply?
Well, yeah, because in essence, what you're doing, you're affecting our sewer system down, which eventually becomes somebody's water supply, not ours. The best thing you can do there is actually have somebody come out and they'll have a multi-blade cut, not the round cut, but the multi-blade that goes through and it'll cut it all the way through. You do that once a year, and it pretty much mitigates that.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Any other questions?
No, just a comment. Whenever I go to National League of Cities, I have
Mhm.
individuals who are just like, can we meet with you about this? Can we meet with you about the service lines? It's just a lot of companies and they try to get you at those conferences.
They do, and again, in some municipalities, especially ones with a lot of older infrastructure, it makes sense. What they're trying to do is they're trying to market their
Mhm.
product through us or in a cooperative venture. This has come to council over the past 15 years I've been here. It seems every couple of years this comes up. With Aurora having newer infrastructure and now with the availability of these riders on homeowners insurance, I think it becomes a less attractive to us. The other thing that they do quite often with many cities, especially back east, where there's less delineation between a tax fund and an enterprise fund, is they'll treat that as a revenue source for general fund. And then that's what they'll say is you could have this much money available to you and things like that. So we have talked with them quite at length about the services they offer. It's just a question of how do we want to associate the city's good name with those services. So other options are available, which helps us a lot. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, item number 10, coming to the conclusion here. Any miscellaneous matters of consideration from council members? All right, well, hearing none, we do have our water workshop on the 26th. Greg, I do believe we meet at the AMC at 7:30 a.m. Does that sound right?
Yes, if you could, yeah, it's because once you get there, you'll see why. There's very little parking at this location of Waterton Canyon. So we'll have a couple large vehicles, so we can at least drive in comfort. But we'll provide the transportation to and from.
Fantastic. And should we bring our fishing poles? Are you going to show us a couple of your sweet honey holes up there for Strontius Springs or the South Platte?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. Yeah, knock yourself out. It's good, but this is a water workshop, and you're not familiar with these, Councilmember Sundberg. We have a lot of information we need to get out there. You see Councilmember from Lawson not in her head. We impart a lot of knowledge over a short amount of time because there's a lot that needs to be covered here. So
Okay, I'll bring my telescoping rod just in case.
okay,
And then our next meeting, Wednesday, September 21st. And that concludes our meeting today. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.